Just recently, VMware released their latest version of their VDI and published app solution, Horizon 2103. This new release provided a great opportunity to rebuild my lab, especially since this release adds a great new feature: the ability to use a Postgres database as the event database. And I want to start by showing how to install and configure the Horizon connection servers. But in case you're new here, I'm Sean Massey. Over the last 10 years, I've worked very closely with mobility and end-user computing technologies. If you want to master these technologies, then join me as I share how-tos, tips and tricks, best practices, and advice from industry experts. So let's talk EUC. Now, before we begin, I want to start by talking about what we'll be covering in the next few videos. This series will be a video companion to a few blog posts in the Horizon series that I wrote back in the fall. You can find links to those posts down below in the description. We will be talking about how to install and configure a small VMware Horizon environment. This is just the install phase activities. I'm not going to cover any of the architectural or fact-finding tasks that would typically be done before the Horizon environment is built. And I'm not going to cover creating the desktop image or deploying resources through Horizon. If these are topics that interest you, I will be covering them in future video series. Hit the subscribe button below and ring the bell to be the first to know when those videos are released. If you can't wait and want to learn more about those topics now, I highly recommend checking out the official VMware reference architectures and collateral on VMware's end-user computing TechZone site at techzone.vmware.com. You can find a link to that page down below in the description. I would highly recommend bookmarking the TechZone site. VMware's end-user computing group creates a lot of amazing content there. If books are your thing, then my friend Johan van Amersfoort also wrote a book on this topic. A link to that book can be found in the description below. In this video, we will be covering how to install the connection server software onto a Windows server. We will also cover some quick tips on configuring the SSL certificate that should be installed with the connection server. The next video in this series will focus on deploying and configuring the Horizon Cloud Connector for licensing, and then integrating these new connection servers into the rest of your environment, such as connecting to vCenter and configuring the Instant Clone domain account for Instant Clone provisioning. We'll also set up the event database. As I mentioned above, Horizon 2103 adds support for Postgres, so we will be using that for our event database. The third and final video of this series will focus on remote access, so we will be deploying the Unified Access Gateway appliances and configuring load balancing. By the end of this series, we will have a functional Horizon environment that is ready to provision desktops and accept user connections. The environment will look like the diagram up on the screen. Today's episode is just going to be focusing on installing the two connection servers that are in the light blue box labeled Horizon Pod. Now, before we can install our connection servers, we need to talk about some of the prerequisites. The Horizon connection server component is installed on Windows servers. Windows Server 2012 R2 or newer are supported. And when deploying in a production environment, these servers should have 4 vCPUs and at least 10 gig of RAM. So we will be deploying two connection servers for our lab environment. Now, Horizon uses Active Directory Lightweight Directory Services, or ADAM as it's commonly known, as its primary data store. So no additional databases are required when setting up a new Horizon environment. The event database is an optional but highly recommended component, as it provides some degree of auditing and logging outside of the server and application logs. The connection server will need to be joined to an Active Directory domain. This does not need to be the same domain where the users or virtual machines will reside. Each connection server should also have a trusted SSL certificate. If one is not available when you set up Horizon on the server, the installer will generate a self-signed certificate, but these really shouldn't be used for production deployments. And finally, we will need to have a vSphere environment for virtual desktops and RDSH servers. We will also want to have a service account with a custom role limiting what that service account can do inside vCenter, and this should be limited to just the features that Horizon needs. The service account will have to have that custom role assigned at the root vCenter object. Now, vCenter isn't required for Horizon. Brokering access to physical desktops is supported, but vCenter is required if you want to use Horizon to manage the power state and lifecycle for user desktops and RDSH servers. Since we're going to be covering instant clone desktops and RDSH farms, we will need vSphere and therefore vCenter. So let's get started with our Horizon deployment. Now, I've already deployed 2 Windows Server 2019 boxes in my lab's virtual environment. I've joined them to my lab domain, and I've installed all the Windows updates. I've also already copied over the Horizon installers, and I've generated my certificates. So even though I've generated the certificates for my lab servers, I do want to talk briefly about what you should do when setting up a production deployment. When deploying Horizon, I like to provide each connection server with a unique certificate so that there isn't a shared certificate for all the internal components. These certificates should be a SAN certificate with entries for the server hostname, both the fully qualified and the short hostname, and the load balanced URL that will be used to access the environment. The friendly name on the certificate also needs to be set to VDM. Now, the steps for generating a certificate will vary. I highly recommend that you talk to the people in your environment who are responsible for managing certificates so you can understand the process for requesting and deploying them. Now, in my lab, I'm using a Windows Enterprise CA, so I generate those certificates and submit them by using the command line tools built into Windows Server. I use a custom INF file to create my certificate request. The INF file contains all the details needed to create the request and submit it to the CA. The INF file in my environment contains the following details: common name, which you won't see here on the screen, a key length of 2048 bits, the exportable public key is enabled with the exportable equals true line, the friendly name set to VDM, and then I have some SAN values for my various DNS entries. Now, if I were to scroll down, you would also see the certificate template name is included in this request, which makes it easier to submit when doing so through the command line. Depending on your environment, this could be a default web server certificate template, or it could be some custom template that your certificate administrators have created to meet the needs and requirements of your environment. If you have any questions about the requirements for a connection server SSL certificate outside of what I outlined here, check the VMware documentation. Now, once the certificates have been created and installed, we can start installing Horizon on the server. Now, I like to have my certificates installed before running the installation tasks because this will prevent Horizon from generating a self-signed certificate and requiring additional service restarts to replace them. Installing the first connection server is pretty straightforward, and we can click Next through most of the installer. However, there are a few places where we will need to make a few choices. The first, obviously, is that we have to accept the end-user licensing agreement before we can proceed with the installation. So click the first circle radio box to accept the term and click Next. The next place where we have to make a choice is on the installation options screen. The first choice we have to make is around the type of connection server we're installing. There are 3 options: standard server, replica server, and Horizon enrollment server. The enrollment server option is used for true SSO, and we're not going to be covering true SSO in this session or in this video series, so we can go ahead and skip that. Now, there isn't much difference between the standard and replica connection servers. Both are full-fledged connection servers. They are functionally identical once they've been installed. The only difference comes when you're standing up your Horizon environment. The standard connection server is the first connection server installed in the Horizon pod. This is the server that instantiates the Atom database instance that's going to be used by all the connection servers. Once this is set up, all other connection servers in the pod or cluster will be replica connection servers because they are joining an existing Atom database group. For this first connection server, we will select the standard connection server option. We will also make sure that install HTML access is checked to install the web access component for accessing desktops. My lab uses IPv4, so we will also select that before clicking Next. On the next screen, we need to select a data recovery password. This is the password that is used to encrypt the Atom database backups that happen automatically nightly. This password should be kept in a safe place as it's required to decrypt the backup files before any backup could be restored into the environment. So we're going to select our password here. We'll just do something easy, like password 1. Now you can also enter a reminder here to give a hint if you need to recover that password. So this could be where you maybe store it. On the next screen, we'll want to select the option to tell the installer to configure Windows Firewall. This will configure all the ports that Horizon uses on the Windows Firewall. Now, if you're on a segmented network, you're using some form of microsegmentation, or you're installing on a cloud IS platform, you will also need to open up these same ports on those firewalls or networks as well. That's outside the scope of this environment. We will also need to configure administrator access to Horizon. The default Horizon administrator is the user running the installer on the first connection server. You can change this to any Active Directory user or group in a trusted domain, or you can set it to the members of the local administrator group on the server. So for this lab build out, we're just going to set this to local admins, but if you're doing this for production, I would create a dedicated Horizon administrators group and assign it here. You can change this after deployment though. Once you sign in, you can update the security, but usually it's better just to do it at this point. Now, the next thing you can do is you can opt to join into the VMware Customer Experience Improvement Program. If you choose to join, just fill in some of the details on your industry, for instance. So we'll just say we're media and entertainment. Our headquarters is in North America, and we have 10,000 employees. No, just kidding. We have very few. Go ahead, we'll click Next. Finally, we need to select our deployment location. This should be general for on-premises environments. When deploying to the cloud, we need to select the option that aligns with the cloud you're deploying to. So for example, if you're deploying into VMware Cloud on AWS, you would select AWS. If you're deploying it into Azure VMware Solution, you would select Azure, and so forth. Now that our first connection server is done, we'll continue on with our second one. The process is basically the same, except that we'll select the Horizon replica server and then provide the DNS name for another connection server in our pod. In our case, there is only one connection server, so we'll use that. So as this install completes, I think we're going to call it a video here. Our Horizon connection servers are up and running, and we'll be able to move on to our next steps in the next video, which should come out in about a week. And just to recap, in that video we're going to talk about the Horizon Cloud Connector and how to deploy that, as well as configure it so that we get our licensing from Horizon Cloud Service. We'll go over configuring integration with vCenter and with Active Directory for instant clones. And finally, we'll wrap this up by deploying the event database on a Postgres database server. So with that, thank you for joining this week. Remember, hit subscribe and hit the bell for notifications to be notified when the next videos in this series come out. And I hope you'll join us next week for another episode of Let's Talk EUC. Thank you.